Now, this is an interesting thing that gets brought up a lot but not necessarily discussed thoroughly, is what are the advantages and disadvantages of a standard bow versus a crossbow. Now, if we look at the medieval versions, the most efficient medieval bow would have been the longbow, due to its massive span, and the most efficient medieval crossbows would have been something like an arbalast, basically a mechanically cocked crossbow. But with modern bows, it gets a bit more complicated because you can make something far more efficient than they could a few hundred years ago, 800 years ago, something like that. So essentially, the how a bow works. I mean, obviously everybody knows how the bow itself works, but what gives it its speed is the length of the actual bow's limbs, and the longer they are, the more power you get. The further the strings pull back, if you want to refer to that as power stroke or something, the further the string goes back will give the arrow or projectile more speed as it leaves, and the draw weight. And that's essentially, the draw weight is the highest tension of the string when it's pulled as far back as it will go. And when you combine the factors, so draw weight, limb length, and the pullback distance, that will increase the power of a bow, which is why actual traditional bows are far more efficient than crossbows in terms of how far they can shoot an arrow, in a sense, with a lower draw weight, because they've got a wider span to do it in, which is why a 60-pound longbow is far superior to many crossbows, because you've got quite a high resilience bow, it's long, and you can pull the string back a long way. So those factors combine to mean that something that isn't necessarily on paper a high draw weight can shoot an arrow very far. Now, the crossbow has disadvantages with it because of the fact that the crossbow, you're pulling a string not as far. And with a medieval crossbow, the power stroke is normally a lot shorter than with a modern rifle crossbow. The limbs generally weren't recurved on medieval crossbows, meaning that you had an even shorter bow span, and the bolts weren't as aerodynamic, meaning you had a combination of factors that meant the crossbow's draw weight would have to be massively higher than a sort of longbow of the period to have anywhere near the same sort of power. I've seen a few sites that suggest that with medieval crossbows being far more inefficient, to equal a sort of 60-pound longbow, you would need to have a crossbow that was 600 to 700 pounds in draw weight with a mechanical crank to actually get a bolt to go at roughly the same velocity as a normal arrow, which is quite surprising. Now, modern crossbows have an advantage because with a modern rifle crossbow, what you have is you have recurved limbs, which means that you're essentially getting a much longer bow length on a smaller space area. And they normally have longer power strokes, so you're getting, again, a longer bow draw with it, as well as longer draw limbs. And the modern crossbow bolts are far more efficient, they're more like arrows than the short little medieval ones, which means that you're getting a combination of better projectile, better bow length, and further bow pull. Now, of course, while on paper the medieval longbow is a far superior weapon to a medieval crossbow, it runs into problems because, as anybody who's shot a bow will know, to get remotely good with traditional archery bow, you'll need to put lots and lots of time and practice into it, which became inefficient for mass-sized medieval armies, obviously during the period. So what happened was, when the crossbow came along, it was a great invention because a relatively untrained soldier, and a lot of places will say untrained soldiers, but that's not true, but a soldier with very basic training could operate one efficiently to the level that you'd have to train an archer with for years to get them to get arrows in such a tight grouping. Now, there's a common media misconception where, longbowmen would be snipers or whatever, which isn't the case. Traditionally, medieval longbowmen or any kind of sort of traditional archer would fire in formations at enemy formations, not aiming for individual soldiers, but it was a saturation weapon where you'd sort of rain arrows down on the enemy. Crossbowmen were far more like the snipers, where they'd be picking out high priority targets. So the crossbow was very efficient in that regard, that it was far easier to aim, so the crossbow bolt was essentially aimed at an individual soldier, not as a saturation weapon. But obviously a skilled archer can still be very accurate with a bow, but that wasn't necessarily how they used them. Now, with medieval bows, you get compound bows as well, and there are some compound bows that can shoot arrows ridiculously fast as well. And compound bows are much easier to aim because you don't have to, have as much arm strength when holding them back. And many of them incorporate sights and things to make them much easier to aim. Another important fact to bear in mind is the strength required to cock either of these devices. With medieval crossbows, once the cranks came into use, the actual power draw of the bow becomes pretty much insignificant because it's just the time taken to crank it. But with hand-spun crossbows, you'd obviously need to be able to exert the force to cock it, and as said earlier, you'd need to have much more physical force to do that because they were inefficient compared to modern crossbows. So if you had a medieval crossbow that was 150 pounds but built using medieval techniques, it would not be able to fire a bolt very far at all because of the inefficiency of the crossbow design of the period. But a traditional bow requires very strong shoulder muscles and very strong arm muscles. If you assume that you have a 60-pound longbow, it would require 60 pounds when you're holding the arrow, and you need to hold the arrow for at least a few seconds to acquire a target properly, even when you become skilled of knowing where the arrow will go, without actually needing to sort of aim it. The issue is that the bow will have to be held at maximum draw for a few seconds while you actually almost mentally acquire a target to shoot. And if you loose the arrow too fast after cocking, you'll find normally the arrow will fly off a bit, wider than you hoped it would. So that's the thing. If you're shooting a longbow over and over and over, it's going to put a lot of muscle stress on you because you have to obviously hold that 60 pounds for a few seconds each time, and you're going to be shooting quite a high volume of arrows. With the crossbow, once you had a mechanical crank on it, it was simply just a matter of moving a winch, which didn't require much force at all, maybe 40 pounds worth of force at most, to crank it. And then that would be for the very high-end crossbows. With the lower ones, probably 10-20 pounds of force to cock it each time. It would take longer to cock, but it was far more efficient in terms of cocking. So that gives us a good idea of the two sort of advantages and disadvantages compared to each one. Now, it's interesting that England was one of the few Western European nations to actually stop using, or to carry on using longbows, whereas most of the European continent countries would be using a crossbow by this point. England didn't completely abandon the crossbow. If you look at a lot of the historical uses of it, longbowmen were the primary use of archers, but they would have had crossbowmen as well as a supporting role, because the crossbow is far more efficient as well for shooting through armour at close ranges than, say, a longbow is, although a longbow can manage it if the arrow hits a weak point in the armour, and a bodkin head on actual longbow arrow is still going to make quite an effect on light armour. However, when we've seen such as Crecy and I think Agincourt as well, when you see actual crossbows used against the longbow, skilled longbowmen will always win against crossbowmen, because for the time period, a longbow had a far, far longer range than the crossbow, and if you have a skilled longbowman, when they're engaging the crossbowman at a longer range than the crossbowman can shoot back, the longbowman can start doing massive damage to a crossbow formation before the crossbow formation even gets in line to in range essentially to shoot back at the longbowman. So really, in conclusion, traditional bows like the longbow for the medieval period were far superior to the crossbow, although the crossbow had the fact on its side that you didn't need to train soldiers very much to use it, which meant for a lot of armies that was a far better idea than the longbow. In modern things, though, crossbows have sort of won out almost against bows, because modern crossbows, because they have much better design mechanics or specifics compared to a medieval crossbow, you get far more power, in that size than you would have done with a medieval crossbow. So, in terms of medieval period, if you could train the soldiers, longbows were more efficient than crossbows. But in modern period, probably Modern rifle crossbow is more efficient than any other kind of bow, and then it's a bit iffy with how it works compared to a compound bow, but then of course you get compound crossbows as well, which give the crossbow another advantage. I hope that's been interesting for some people, and it's quite a fascinating subject.